Hello, welcome to another mini episode of the Dugout podcast. In this mini episode, I'll be reading an excerpt from Assata Shakur's biography titled Assata. If you haven't listened to part one of this mini episode where I break down her biography and some core takeaways from her legacy as a Black revolutionary badass, you should go back and check that out because there's all sorts of information and different philosophical questions to consider. We dig into a lot of things in that mini episode, so be sure to check that out. And also, consider getting a copy of this biography. It's available basically everywhere online. You could just go somewhere like Anarchist Library and you will be able to find it. This reading will begin on page 181. In addition to a lot of things that I was not too happy about, plans, priorities, and procedures were changed daily, and most of the time the changes were ill-conceived. Everything had an arbitrary air to it, and I certainly did not have the feeling that we were waging a step-by-step analytical struggle. There was little internal conflict in either the Harlem branch or the New York chapter. For the most part, Panthers were a friendly, open group of people who really went out of their way to be kind and helpful, and in spite of all the pressure and hardships they had to deal with, managed to be principled and to fight as hard as they knew how for our people. We had a bit of a leadership problem with Robert May and Jolly, who were both from the West Coast. Bay's problem was that he was none too bright, and he had an aggressive, even belligerent way of talking and dealing with people. Jolly's problem was that he was Robert Bay's shadow. Bay later became Huey Newton's bodyguard, a job for which he was much more suited. Cotton had come to Harlem from California. Everyone loved him. He was everybody's main man. He had known Bobby Carter, Lil Bobby Hutton, and the Chief David Hillard, and of course, the Rage Eldridge Cleaver. Cotton had been sent to New York and put in charge of fixing up the brownstone the party had bought on 127th Street. According to the grapevine, Huey wanted to move the Black Panther Party headquarters to New York, and Cotton was to prepare the security for the house. He used to mosey over to the Harlem office with a bottle of cheap pluck in his back pocket and tell war stories. He would sip his wine and talk about what had gone down on the coast. The first time I went over to inspect the 127th Street house, Cotton gave me a guided tour. He explained the whole futuristic security plan. He was going to hook up the security system so that if so much as a foot was put on the front steps of the building, an alarm would alert the security officers outside. If it was the pigs, huge floodlights would be turned on, blinding them. Thick metal doors would glide into place, and a lot of other fantastic things would happen that I don't remember. I kept my mouth shut because I knew absolutely nothing about security, but I silently wondered why he didn't put stuff in that was more conventional, like a closed-circuit TV. I had a special interest in the building since the ground floor and the basement were designated to be the free health clinic. At the time, the basement was a disaster with no plumbing, no heat, no electricity, and a mountain load of bricks, powder, and debris. Cotton assured me that the basement would be fixed up within 6 months. Next, he showed me Huey's room. It was the only room in the house somewhat fixed up. He had put up the wooden paneling, and there was a small table and a single bed, which he carefully explained to me was made up in military style, ready at all times for the minister. I looked at him like he was crazy. Of all the things I could imagine Huey doing, sleeping in that freezing house on that Spartan bed was not one of them. Cotton talked about Huey with this eerie reverence that made me sick, and it sounded sure enough weird, how Cotton talked about the minister's bed. I visited the house on 127th Street many times over the next few months. Hard as I tried, I could not find one shred of progress. I came to the conclusion that Cotton was a big mouth and a drunk, but everybody kept telling me how hard he was working, so I figured he was working on something secret they had obviously decided not to tell me about. During one of my trips to the house, Cotton's assistant told me he didn't feel well. I made an appointment with the doctor and called to tell him the time. A few days later, when I came into the office, everyone looked at me like I'd committed some crime against the people. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Cotton says the brother who works for him is sick and that you refuse to do anything for him." "What?" I was completely surprised. "That's not true." "Cotton says that's what happened." Fired up mad, I tried to get Cotton on the phone, but it was out of order. I tried to figure out why Cotton had made such a fuss. The only conclusion that I could come to is that he was annoyed with me because I kept pushing him to get the clinic in order. Several years later, after the Freedom of Information Act was passed, it was revealed that Cotton had been working undercover for the police. Things seemed to be going from bad to worse. Although there wasn't much dissension in the New York branch, there was beaucoup dissension and disunity on the national level. Every other weekend, somebody was going out to the West Coast to deal with contradictions. Everybody was uptight and miserable, and then everything started to happen at once. First, there was an article stating that Huey was living in a $650 a month apartment in Oakland. The Harlem branch was shocked because In those days, there was a whole lot of rent, and it contrasted sharply with the living conditions of the Panthers in New York. Panthers who owned little more than the clothes on their backs were out in the street in the freezing cold selling papers, with big pieces of cardboard in their shoes, and with flimsy jackets that did nothing to hold back the hawk. The party issued a statement that Huey was living in the apartment for security purposes, but a lot of Panthers were not at all convinced. I wanted to believe the security story, but it did not fit my sense of logic. Then came the long series of expulsions, which proved to be the last straw. Many long-standing, loyal Panthers were expelled by Huey. One of the first to go in Huey's private purge was Jeramino Elmer Pratt. Jeramino was widely respected, somewhat of a Panther folk hero. When I heard about it, the first thing I did was to go to someone else who knew and try to figure out the real deal. Although paranoid and upset, the person broke down the story for me, just enough to let me know that the expulsion was probably unjust. I couldn't imagine Jeramino becoming an enemy of the people any more than I can imagine myself being one. Then came the expulsions of the Panther 21, supposedly for writing an open letter to the Weatherman that was somewhat critical of Black Panther Party policies. I'd read the letter and couldn't find anything in it to merit such extreme action, especially since it might prove prejudicial to the ongoing trial. I was becoming more and more critical of what was going on in the party, but I loved it nevertheless and wanted to see it functioning on the right track. For the first time, I questioned whether I could continue within the party. Almost every project I was working on was frustrated and barely able to get off the ground. The Saturday Liberation School, the Free Clinic, and all of the student work here were on hold. I, frustrated and a bit demoralized. This party was a lot different from the Black Panther Party I had fallen in love with. Gone were the black berets and leather jackets because of police harassment. Panthers had been ordered not to wear the uniform except for special occasions. Gone were the Panther marches, the Panther songs. Gone were the Free Huey, Free Bobby songs sung to the tune of Wade in the Water. Gone were the Big Panther buttons and Big Panther flags flapping in the wind. Everything felt different. The easy openness had been replaced by fear and paranoia. The beautiful revolutionary creativity I had loved so much was gone and replaced by dogmatic stagnation. It was around this time that Zayd and I had our big falling out, and I had made a list of criticisms of the party, along with a list of things I thought were positive and a lot of suggestions. I thought I might correct some of the problems that the party was facing. I called Zayad and told him I needed to talk to him. When he arrived, I bared my heart and soul to him. I must have talked for a good 2 or 3 hours, raising all of the political and tactical concerns I had. Zayd listened to everything I said without taking any position one way or another. Then he told me he had to leave and would talk to me another time. I was furious. I felt he was acting in his role as leadership and using our friendship to gain information about how I thought, to gauge the level of dissensation within the ranks. Throughout my days in the party, I've always been outspoken and blunt. Zayd and I had always been frank with each other, and I interpreted his silence as a declaration that he supported and defended policies I considered unprincipled and politically incorrect. After that, we didn't see or speak to each other for a long time. I had no way of knowing the thin tightrope he was walking on or the pressure he was under. Zayd was acting as a peacemaker between Huey and the Panther 21, furiously trying to get Huey to rescind his expulsion order. Zayd felt that to take any position in reference to the problems within the party might jeopardize his role and result in dire consequences for the Panther 21. Setawayo and Daruba, who had not been expelled because they were out on bail and had not signed the letter, were also attempting to get the Panther 21 reinstated. They were under a lot of pressure from both sides. Huey wanted them to support the expulsion, and the expelled Panthers wanted them to criticize Huey's actions. Like Zayd, Set, and Daruba honestly believed that they could straighten out the madness, and if it were not for the FBI, they probably could have. Nobody back then had ever heard of the counterinsurgents program Quinto Pro set up by the FBI. Nobody could possibly have known the FBI had sent a phony letter to Eldridge Cleaver in Algiers, signed by the Panther 21, criticizing Huey P. Newton's leadership. No one could have known that the FBI had sent a letter to Huey's brother saying that the New York Panthers were plotting to kill him. No one could have known that the FBI's Quinto Pro was attempting to destroy the Black Panther Party in particular and the Black liberation movement in general, using divide and conquer tactics. The FBI Quintel program consisted of turning members of organizations against each other, pitting one Black organization against another. Huey ended up suspecting Set and Daruba from the Panther Party, branded them as enemies of the people, and caused them to go into hiding, in fear for their very lives. No one had the slightest idea that the whole scenario was carefully manipulated and orchestrated by the FBI. When they brought the Black Panther newspaper to the office, the one that branded Deruba, Set, and Set's wife, Connie Matthews Tabor, as enemies of the people, I refused to sell it and attacked it as an outright lie. I had been so outspoken about my criticisms that I knew it was just a matter of time before I, too, would be expelled. Sick and disgusted, I decided it was time for me to leave the party. Thank you for listening to this mini episode of The Dugout. Be sure to follow us on social media, especially Instagram, and consider supporting us on Substack. Stay tuned till next time.